All right, let's begin. Today, we're conducting a detailed, phase-by-phase doctrinal analysis of the military operation to break the 1936 siege of Oviedo. This was an operation that would really come to define the early stages of the war in the north.
Now, before we dive in, it's important to note that this entire briefing is based on the comprehensive work of Colonel F.J. Victor Rodrigo. For anyone wanting a deeper study of the primary sources, we absolutely recommend you consult his website.
So, here's how we'll break it down. We'll start with the initial situation and the key strategic decision. Then we'll walk through the 3 phases of the advance, look at the critical turning point, and wrap it all up with a full after-action analysis.
Okay, Section 1. Let's really get a handle on the initial problem. By September 1936, the Nationalist garrison in Oviedo was on the verge of collapse. Relieving the city wasn't just an option anymore, it had become an absolute operational imperative.
Now, this map really shows you the strategic dilemma they were facing. Command had to choose between 2 potential axes of advance to even get to the city. All the while, the defenders inside Oviedo were under constant bombardment, getting pushed back into their final defensive positions. The situation was getting more desperate by the day.
So, this was the choice. The northern route through Avilés. It was just too slow, too complex, and would have eaten up way too many resources. That left the direct route through Grado. It was chosen purely out of necessity. Sure, it was faster and required fewer troops, but it came with a huge risk. A direct, frontal attack that would create a long, narrow corridor, a pasillo, with incredibly vulnerable flanks. It was a high-risk gamble, forced by a lack of options and extreme urgency.
Moving on to Phase 1, which kicks off on September 11th. The immediate objectives were simple on paper: cross the Narcea River and take the town of Grado.
As you can see on the map, 3 nationalist columns started the advance, crossing the Narcea on an 8-kilometer front. Now, the Republican commander, Linares Aranzabe, he was no fool. He knew the operational key to this whole sector was the high ground at Cabruñana. He set up a very well-organized defense there, and his troops inflicted heavy casualties, showing right from the start just how fierce the resistance was going to be.
And that brings us to Phase 2. After taking Grado, the push towards Trubia just became a grueling, brutal slog. This phase was all about a slow, costly advance against dug-in defenses and, this is critical, non-stop enemy attacks against those long, vulnerable flanks of the corridor.
And these 2 maps illustrate the tactical problem perfectly. You can see how Republican forces kept infiltrating across the Nalón River to hit the supply lines. And these weren't just nuisance raids, these were serious attempts to cut the corridor and trap the lead units. The Nationalist advance had to stop again and again just to turn around and secure its own rear.
At this stage, the whole operation was in real danger of getting bogged down and failing. But then, 2 external factors came into play that would completely change the operational calculus: a strategic move by the Republican Navy and the arrival of elite nationalist combat troops.
And here we see a really fascinating strategic paradox. In late September, the Republican fleet sailed from the Mediterranean up to the Cantabrian Sea. They thought this would increase pressure on the northern coast, but what it actually did was fatally weaken their control over the Strait of Gibraltar. This gave the Nationalists the opening they needed. They engaged the remaining Republican ships, secured the strait, and immediately started ferrying thousands of battle-hardened troops from the Army of Africa to the mainland.
And this timeline shows you the direct result of that naval victory. Starting on October 4th, you see a steady stream of elite units arriving at the front. Banderas of the Legion, Tabors of Regulares. These weren't conscripts, these were highly experienced professional soldiers, and they provided the fresh combat power that was absolutely necessary to break the stalemate.
The arrival of these reinforcements changed the whole game. It allowed for a fundamental shift in the plan of attack. The main effort was now moved north of the Nalón River to bypass the toughest enemy defenses and begin the final push on Oviedo.
And this new axis of advance, spearheaded by those fresh Legion and Regulares units, proved to be brutally effective. As you can see, they just punched their way through a series of well-defended positions, taking key terrain like Escamprero in one violent, close-quarters assault after another.
This quote, taken directly from battlefield reports at the time, really hammers home the sheer ferocity of this final phase. It says, "The field between Soto and Escamprero appears strewn with corpses." The human cost of breaking through those last lines was just exceptionally high, for both sides.
The final breakthrough came on October 17th. In the morning, a column under Commander Gallegos took the strategic Naranco Heights overlooking the city. Then, by evening, a second column under Commander Jacobo Lopez finally made physical contact with the city's defenders. It was 7:30 p.m. After 37 straight days of combat, the siege was finally broken.
So let's wrap this up with our after-action analysis. We'll assess the strategic impact of the operation, look at the cost, and examine the new military reality that it created in the north.
From a strategic standpoint, the relief of Oviedo was a severe blow to Republican morale. You have to understand, the fall of the city would have been a huge propaganda victory for them. The fight was considered so important that both sides diverted critical assets here. The Nationalists sent elite units that were badly needed for the assault on Madrid, and the Republicans fixated forces on taking the city that could have been used elsewhere.
But here's the crucial takeaway. Relieving Oviedo solved one military problem, but it immediately created another one. What they ended up with wasn't a stable front line. It was this narrow, precarious salient that was completely dominated by enemy-held high ground. It was a purely temporary situation, a launching point for future operations, sure, but in and of itself, it was a total defensive nightmare.
And the cost of this 37-day operation gives you a very clear picture of its intensity. We don't have exact figures for the Republican side, but the Nationalists suffered over 2,600 casualties. And get this, 1,600 of those, well over half, happened in that final brutal 25-kilometer push from Grado to Oviedo.
This final disposition map really tells the story. The Nationalists now had about 21,700 men in this sector, and they were facing Republican forces estimated somewhere between 30 and 40,000. But the most critical number is this. 2/3 of the entire Nationalist force, that's 14,000 men, were needed just to stand guard on the flanks of the corridor they had just created. These images, they were taken from the Vertice Paisano right after it was captured. They give you a real sense of the terrain they fought over. From this single vantage point, command could look down on the city they had sacrificed so much to relieve, and they could also see the thin, fragile corridor that was now its only lifeline.
In the end, the relief of Oviedo was an incredibly audacious operation. It was really born of desperation and won through sheer tenacity. And this image of a soldier from the Regulares standing on those captured heights, it serves as a powerful symbol of the decisive role played by those elite, battle-hardened reinforcements in that final bloody assault.
The operation was a success, yes, but it wasn't an ending. It created a completely new, highly unstable military reality. And this raises the critical question that commanders on both sides were now grappling with. With this precarious Oviedo corridor as the new focal point, what would be the next move in the war for the North?